This episode is brought to you by Therapy Notes.
Looking to streamline your practice? Whether you're a solo clinician or part of a group practice, Therapy Notes has all the tools you need to succeed. Now offering their legendary customer service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Try Therapy Notes for 2 months free using promo code MODERN today. You're already listening to our podcast, so let's get you some continuing education.
We provide monthly CE pod courses. We already have 12 and are adding new ones every month.
Check them out at moderntherapistcommunity.com/pod course.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhelm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhelm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that happen in our practice, the people that we serve, the things that happen in therapists' lives. And I'm always happy when we come across topics that we have not been able to get to before, and especially things that we are coming in with kind of very little direct experience ourselves, and being able to just turn to super wonderful people to share their expertise with us. And we are getting into working with religious trauma today, and we are joined by Anna Clark Miller, LPC, LMHC, and she also has, I love the name of your podcast, a wonderful podcast called Martyr, She Wrote, a religious trauma podcast, and author of the Religious Trauma Survival Guide. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing some time and your expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Before we begin, we're going to give you the question that we give to all of our guests. Who are you and what are you putting out into the world?
Who am I? That is the question, right? The existential question. So I'm an existential therapist. I work with religious trauma. That's my specialty. My passion is really just finding people who, like me, grew up with trauma and are looking for the possibility of a life that is better, that has meaning, that has, rest and joy. And so being a therapist is one way that I do that. But, writing my book was sort of a way to hopefully give that hope to people who maybe don't feel comfortable going to therapy, or maybe have been burned by a therapist in the past. And so trauma recovery is really what I'm about.
Before we jump in, I have a question, because I hear religious trauma, like people talking about it was religious trauma. It's religious trauma. What exactly does it mean? What is religious trauma?
That's a good question. And I think it's complex. It's literally complex trauma because it's something that happens from a lot of different incidents over, a long period of time. Usually religious trauma clients don't have one singular event. I mean, unless they got, exorcised or something, it's usually repeated events. And so religious trauma is like any trauma in that it impacts the nervous system, where you've got all these triggers and they come up at inconvenient times. And a lot of times with religious trauma survivors, those triggers have to do with your beliefs about the world, about the afterlife, about God. And they also typically have to do with following rules and conforming to something that, a religious group at one point told them this is the right way to live.
I have some thoughts that I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but I think we're a little bit early in the conversation on this. So one of the other questions that we kind of start off with in a place of not knowing, but also a place of helping educate people, if there's mistakes to be made in working with people who've had religious trauma, if we can help our listeners not make those same mistakes, like what are the kinds of things that you see people who might not be experienced working with religious trauma, what do you see them doing?
Yeah, I think a common dynamic that happens with religious trauma survivors is they have complicated relationships with authority figures. And a survivor who's coming into therapy for the first time might have it in their mind that you, as the therapist, are going to be their new guru, their new spiritual leader, their new authority. And that puts you in a really delicate space because you don't want to just repeat the same patterns that they have already been abused with, which are, somebody else telling them how to think, what to believe, literally someone else telling them how to be happier and how to live life the right way. And so it's real easy, I think, for therapists to inadvertently sort of slip into that role as the teacher and forget that one of the most important elements of religious trauma recovery is empowering them to own themselves and to own their own minds and own their decisions and not have that be something that they choose based on what an authority figure has told them is correct.
Before the episode, you were mentioning that you're a supervisor. How do you help therapists in training kind of identify the steps that they need to take in response to being aware of that particular role that I don't know that it's necessarily assigned, but that they can accidentally step into?
One of the early signs you can spot is when a client comes in and they've got a notebook and they want to take notes about every word that you have to say. And, they want homework after every single session. And it's almost like they want a gold star for therapy. Like they want to get an A+ in therapy. And to me, that's a hint that maybe they've had a lot of, high achieving patterns in the past that have helped them please high control religious leaders, or maybe even a controlling deity, that they believed in. And to me, the real change, the work of therapy has nothing to do with pleasing somebody else. And so it really takes a lot of intentional work early on to just reframe from the point of this is not for you to reach a version of healthiness that I envision for you, or your family envisions for you, or your religious group envisions for you. It's to really get into your body and decide what that is for you. And so when I have a client that comes in that seems to be really seeking my approval a whole lot, I know that I need to moderate how many suggestions I'm making and be a whole lot more curious and a whole lot more just focused on empowering them to answer their questions.
Yeah, I like to go to the question of, and how are you going to make a decision about that? What are the things that you're considering? Just like really making it very clear. I'm not going to tell you what to do.
Yeah. 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 Well, and I love engaging in a pros and cons, discussion. Like, okay, what are some of the things that might go well if you do that decision? What are the things that might not go well? And so I don't mind engaging in that. I'm certainly not going to just abandon them to, figure everything out on their own, but I'm not going to lead. I'm not the lead, I'm not taking the lead. And I think your religious trauma clients will often make you feel pressured a little bit to take the lead. And that's a sign that you need to resist that urge.
It can be hard though. What are some of the other signs and symptoms of religious trauma?
There are several pretty hallmark symptoms. The first one is shame. So shame, as we know, is something that impacts people who have religious trauma and don't have religious trauma. But when it comes to high control religion, there is a whole lot of moralizing around not just behaviors, but personality traits, thoughts, normal actions that every human does. And because there's so much moralizing and judgment, it is really, really easy to slip into a mindset of I'm never enough. I'm never good enough. I'm never doing enough to please my deity or please my religious group leaders. And that becomes a self-defeating pattern of, learned helplessness, an external locus of control, of perfectionism that is, just never ever going to be enough. And so there's a lot of overworking and self-neglect. And so that shame piece is a big one. Another big hallmark symptom of religious trauma is rigid thinking. This one makes a lot of sense if you think about having a high control group tell you what to believe and telling you what is right and wrong repeatedly. You basically groom your brain into thinking in binary. Everything is right or it's wrong. Everything is either good or it's bad. Someone is either in my group or they're not in my group. And there's not a lot of room for nuance. There's not a lot of room for curiosity and exploration. And that could be for anything, whether it's, ethical topics or personal identity. There are just a lot of things that get really segmented into rigid categories. And that is honestly probably the hardest element of religious trauma recovery, is getting out of that rigid thinking. Another symptom is fear, just a lot of overwhelming fear and terror. And you see this particularly in groups that talk about the consequences of not being in that religious group. So, hell is a great example of, the most horrible imaginable thing that we can conjure up, where you're not only separated from all of your loved ones, but you're being tortured for eternity. That terror is visceral for a lot of folks with religious trauma. I know people who have nightmares frequently about, the rapture happens and they've been left behind. But not only is that fear, about the afterlife, but it can also be about things like spiritual forces here present day. There's a lot of superstition among religious groups. If you do this certain thing, or you say this certain sin, or even you think a particular thought that is wrong, you might be attacked by an evil spirit. You might be possessed, or God himself or themselves might, smite you with a disease. There's a lot of terror that comes from this very mystical consequence system that is in a lot of high control beliefs. The last couple of symptoms that I keep an eye out for are suppression of identity and emotional suppression, because that's based on conformity. And then the last one is relationship dysfunction. We know cults, high control religious groups, they do enmeshment really well. and there's a lot of trauma bonding, there's a lot of authority dysfunction that goes with that, and so that's also a big element.
Therapy Notes is the highest rated EHR for behavioral health, and it's easy to see why. They combine billing, scheduling, documentation, and more into one sleek, easy-to-use platform, and they're always adding new features to help therapists provide better care to their patients.
Therapy Notes allows you to do it all, whether you're a solo clinician or part of a group practice. And with their new 24/7 hours, they're ready to assist you no matter where your practice takes you. Learn more at therapynotes.com and use promo code MODERN for 2 months free. I was going to ask about whether it's high control religious groups or cults. Are there differences that you see, or is this kind of all the same pot of folks?
You can ask a lot of different religious trauma therapists, and they probably all have different answers. To me, those two words are very synonymous. I think I prefer using high control religion just because cult is frankly an offensive word to a lot of people. But high control religion is more of a descriptor that specifies it's not religion itself that is the problem. It's the high control part of religion. And that's really what a cult is a high control religion. The only place where that terminology gets a little sticky is with groups like, like Scientology, for example, which many would call a high control religion, but also they don't consider it to be a religion. It's more of an ideology. The high control is really the point. But when we think of a cult, we think of an insulated group with lots of rules, with, rigid expectations. And that's exactly what I mean when I say high control religion.
As I'm sitting here listening to you go through all of these descriptions, I immediately see where you're like, yes, this is complex PTSD. It's, I'm just going through, oh, this is how this has showed up in my office, minus the religious piece. This is how this has shown up. And so I, don't want to be like, oh, all religious trauma is just CPTSD, because the question that I was thinking about earlier is also, there's probably also a tremendous social impact and social change, especially if this is the entire community that surrounds somebody. This is not just dealing with the trauma, but this is also potentially uprooting every social relationship that somebody has.
Absolutely. Early in my career, I worked with domestic violence survivors, and it's striking to me how similar the dynamics are of leaving a partner who is abusive and leaving a high control religious group, because especially if you rely financially and socially on that partner or that group, there are so many reasons to stay stuck. And one of them absolutely is that a lot of folks who leave high control religion lose everything. They lose their family, they lose their closest friends. Many of them lose their marriages. They lose, the foundation of what they've kind of built their worldview around. A lot of people rethink their identity. It is completely excruciating. And it definitely, I think, is a reason why a lot of people who recognize that they're unhappy in a high control group decide not to leave, because there's a whole lot to lose there. And that's why religious trauma therapy is so important, because we need to create hope that there is life beyond that group. You can have intimate relationships beyond that group that are safe. You can have a belief system and a philosophy of life that isn't just that one that has been taught to you. But you're right that the implications are a lot beyond just the flashbacks and, hypervigilance of complex PTSD, but it's the social aspect of, how am I going to fit into the world? How do I even talk to people, when I have only ever framed my social interactions around religious conversations? It's tough.
You talk about building hope, and that makes so much sense. And I'm trying to sort through, how do you support someone that has to completely remake their life, completely remake their worldview? Like, what does treatment actually look like for these folks?
Well, one of the first things that I, will do with the client is find out where they are on that journey. Have they already left, or are they still in the group and thinking about it? If they're still in the group, I know this is going to be a long haul. This is going to be a long process, because if you try to do it rip off the Band-Aid style, that is going to absolutely create a crisis, and and none of us want that. If you've ever read Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, she talks about the 3 stages of trauma recovery. The first one is establishing safety. And I think that is where I start with religious trauma as well. And it's establishing a sense of safety within your own self, because it's a lot easier to tackle those bigger challenges, like, how do I talk to my family? How do I, what do I do with my week evenings now that I'm not volunteering all the time? Those are all easier to do if you feel safe in trusting yourself to know what you feel, to know what you want and need, and feel empowered to advocate for yourself. So that's kind of the first step.
A lot of the work that we talk about as far as therapists in this is also kind of the person of the therapist, how we enter into a lot of this. And I imagine that there's a lot of balancing out just kind of our own relationships with religion, and whether it comes from our own experiences of being in high controlled religions or people who have healthy relationships with their religion. I guess I'm looking for, what kind of guidance do you have for therapists as far as being able to kind of set that piece of themselves into working in this kind of a treatment type setting?
I think most therapists who work with trauma have some kind of trauma in their own history. So it certainly doesn't disqualify you. But I think the most important element for a therapist to work through on their own prior to working with religious trauma clients is that rigid thinking piece, because it is really easy to not recognize something as a personal bias if the way that you've been framing it in your head is, well, this is just right and that's wrong, or this is healthy and that is unhealthy. Whenever we start putting things in binary categories like that, we run a really high risk of shaming our clients or of missing the context that completely explains why they are thinking and acting the way they are. And so that was a big challenge for me when I first started working with religious trauma clients, because I was looking at it through the lens of my own experience and, getting real mad about the stuff that made me mad, in my experience. But that may not have been where the client was. And I think I, inadvertently alienated some clients that way. And I just realized, like, I need to take 2 steps back with my judgments, with my, automatic assumptions about what's right and wrong, what's healthy and unhealthy, what's codependent and not codependent, and focus on what the client is experiencing. What are they feeling in their body? Because if it is unhealthy, they're going to figure that out by listening to themselves. They don't need me to say it. So I think that's probably the biggest thing to set aside. But, I also think it really does a lot to verbalize with religious trauma clients. I don't know the answer to that. I'm learning too. That normalizes to them that it's okay to change what you believe. It's okay to decide that you think something different. In fact, I'm doing that right now too,
Really being able to model that piece that's just kind of like, it's okay to not be in this dichotomous kind of thinking space here. And that's part of the growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainty is not the goal.
Yeah.
Questioning is the goal.
I guess for me, that is something I'd like to go deeper into, because there's your own work and there's kind of looking at how do you get more curious? How do you go beyond binary or certainty or those types of things? Maybe a little bit more to the work that you do to help clients with rigid thinking, because that gets so frustrating for me when someone is so caught in their own little tiny perspective of the world. And sometimes I'm able to hang with it and get going with it, and other times I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Breaking in here real quick to tell you how much fun it is to put out longer form episodes and provide some CEs. I'm having fun. Are you, Katie?
Mostly. We've got some great stuff lined up for this year, and we've already got some amazing courses.
Suicide, parental alienation, dual relationships, law and ethics.
And some lighter stuff like walk and talk therapy, elite athletes, celebrities, executives, and goal setting.
All you need to do is hop over to moderntherapistcommunity.com/podcourse, where once you listen to the episode, you just have to fill out a quiz and an evaluation to get credit.
Something that I like to focus on early on is judging emotions. And so a lot of times, clients will come in, and this is religious trauma or not, any client will come in with sort of automatic judgments about what they're feeling and why it's either a good thing or a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I can, say, okay, well, wait, slow down. Let's notice that feeling. And before you judge it as good or bad, let's just observe it. Let's just be a scientist for a second and gather some data. And then we can look at the data and then decide, okay, is this helping or not helping? And then once we kind of talk about emotions that way, then we can start to talk about beliefs. Beliefs are thoughts mixed with emotions, right? And so beliefs are harder to not judge immediately, but we need to get in that same habit of noticing a framework and then saying, hang on, before I make a determination of whether that's true or not true, or unhealthy or healthy, let's take a step back and let's just investigate. Let's just examine the implications. Let's examine how that belief impacts you. Let's examine how it's impacted people you know and love. Let's examine, what the research has to say. And then it's sort of like by suspending that judgment, you get to actually let yourself think out of the rigid box that you've been trapped in. So it's mostly a lot of talking about exploring with non-judgment.
Are there special considerations in how this might disproportionately affect the LGBTQ plus community? That I imagine that, I don't know, being around institutions that argue against one's very existence in the first place might affect them even more so than other people.
Yeah. Shocking, right? That it does impact them a whole lot. Conversion therapy is a major driver of LGBTQ suicide rates. And conversion practices, by the way, are, any effort to force somebody to change who they are, whether that is their sexuality or their gender identity, or, even aspects of their personality that don't fit in with a high control group's ideals. But yeah, the queer community for a long time has been deprived in religion of even the ability to name themselves. Growing up, I was not allowed to use the word gay because my parents told me that's not a thing.
Mm.
And that erasure is so painful for folks in the queer community. And it's so important to validate their existence and create that safety and autonomy before you start diving into all the other work of trauma, because there needs to be a whole lot of autonomy and safety felt first.
Seems like so much of this is identity work, curiosity, opening up, kind of perspectives, getting really creative in kind of looking at the world and trying to help them to get out of very rigid, self-denying types of mindset. As we're running low on time, I'd love to kind of hear maybe a little bit more of an overview of what the full arc of the treatment might look like for someone that comes in specifically looking at addressing their religious trauma.
We will often, talk about symptoms first. And that's kind of for me to get a gauge of how self-aware they are. And then oftentimes we'll spend a lot of focus on connecting with body. If you're familiar with the term spiritual bypassing, that's sort of a habit of using spiritual terminology to just skip past uncomfortable ideas or feelings. And religious trauma survivors have an uncanny ability to just push aside uncomfortable things and, uncomfortable body sensations even that are really important information that they need to know in order to start recovering. And so we'll do a lot of work on noticing what your body's feeling, trusting your body rather than, saying, nope, it's bad, it's tempting me, it's evil. It's like, no, you can listen to that. That's real information. Another, treatment thing that we do is focusing on what healthy relationships with other people can look like. And a lot of times that's reimagining what close relationships look like, where it's not all about enmeshment, and you don't have to be in full agreement with someone else in order to be close with them. You don't have to completely have all of these same opinions on like politics, everything. You can still know someone and have your own separate identity. That's a big part of recovery. And then, we do deconstruction. It depends on the client. But if a client is more of a cognitive person and they are able to connect cognitive ideas with emotional, then a lot of times we will talk about deconstruction, sort of like, the topic of hell would be an example. And I'll say, okay, I hear what you're thinking about that. Now tell me what you're feeling about that. What does it feel like when you talk about the idea of hell or when you think about it? And a lot of times that's where that spiritual bypassing gets sort of taken out of the equation. And now we have to actually think about the discomfort. It's not fun, but it actually helps them make a lot of progress pretty quickly, because now it's like, we can't just move over and ignore it.
Sounds like there's a tremendous amount of mindfulness that you introduce. And I'm wondering how direct you are as far as just being like, mindfulness. This is the skill that we're just going to work on to get to some of these goals.
So that's a tricky one, because with this population, a lot of folks especially who grow up in high control religion, are warned about the dangers of secular psychology, of mindfulness, of meditation, yoga, these are all things that are villainized in some religious groups. And so I do have to be really careful about labeling it with words that are maybe more mainstream, because I don't want that to scare them, like, oh, this is what my mom warned me about,
Yeah.
But if it is a client that I can tell has kind of, they're on TikTok, like they know what those words really mean, then yeah, I'll mention that. But it's a slow ushering in.
That's so interesting, because I think there's so many different places that our clients are coming in with ideas from. And so a lot of this, I feel like there is the old therapist phrase, it depends, and meet
Yeah.
your client where they are, and all of those things. But it seems like this work is very, very intense, isn't quite the right word, but I'll use it. It seems like there's so much that is impacted by this type of trauma and this type of lifestyle that pulling, kind of pulling someone out of that. And that's the wrong word too, because, of course they're coming out and you're just helping them to have a container to figure it all out. But it seems like there's so many opportunities to potentially cause harm, overstepping and telling somebody what to do, or invalidating, or judging, or getting frustrated because of the rigidity of their thinking. Like, how do you take care of yourself as a therapist and working with this population? Because it seems like there is definitely opportunities to have burnout or exhaustion lead you down the wrong road.
Well, something that I figured out a long time ago was that it takes pressure off of me to be perfect if I can say something short to a client and say, how did that impact you just now? What did you feel when I said that? And that way I can let them tell me if I did something that was triggering inadvertently, and I don't have to constantly be second guessing if, I'm saying the perfect words. But also out of therapy, when it's my personal time, I have a lot of friends and family that I can talk very frankly with about my opinions on this. I can vent, and that gives me the opportunity to not feel like I'm just holding in all of my personal emotions. I have an outlet for it. I have a place where I can express my opinions, even if they're wrong, and I don't need to worry that I'm leading someone astray. I think it's a balance, and any trauma therapist will tell you, you got to play it by ear. 1 week I'll feel like, oh, I've got a good balance of the number of clients I'm seeing and all that. And then the next week I'm like, I am on the brink of burnout. I need to pull way back, and you just every week it's kind of like time to reassess and just listen to your body and, do what takes care of you.
I guess I have one last question from my end here is, in working with populations like this, where there is kind of that expectation of perfection or you being a guru, and kind of balancing this idea that you're not going to be perfect, how upfront are you about that idea that, hey, I'm probably going to not meet your expectation. I'm probably going to be a disappointment to you in somehow.
Yeah.
How upfront are you with that?
I don't know that I've ever said I'm probably going to disappoint you, but I definitely have said I am not the expert here. And I am not here to tell you what to do or what's going to make you happy. And I've even told clients, like, there's a good chance that I will say something or recommend something that is going to rub you the wrong way. And you're going to have some feelings about it. And I want you to tell me that, because my ego is not so fragile that I can't get that feedback and hear it and not take it personally, And so, yeah, I'm pretty explicit about that, especially if they do seem to be wanting to create that, authority sort of dynamic.
But not like Curt saying, I'm going to disappoint you.
You're going to be horribly disappointed at some point, and that's part of your growth. Like,
you should go ahead and leave therapy now, because you can't trust me.
I will fail you so many times.
Can you tell us more about the book that you wrote?
Yeah. So the Religious Trauma Survival Guide, it's called Education and Recovery Tools for Survivors and Professionals. So it is for survivors of religious trauma and therapists working with them, or church leaders who are working with survivors. And it's all, the first half of the book is education about what is religious trauma, what are high control dynamics that create religious trauma, what are some of the biggest patterns that we see in this field. And then the second half is all about recovery tools. And it has a lot of self-guided reflection prompts for people going through the book to think through and answer. It has a lot of inventories. You can check off, like, what are some of the different shame-based beliefs that I've taken away from my experience in high control religion. So really the purpose of this book is to bring self-awareness and encourage those early stages of healing that can be done either while in therapy, or even if you're not in therapy, you also get to heal.
For therapists who want to dig deeper into this, what kinds of trainings would you recommend?
So I offer a 3-hour therapist training through my consulting company, Empathy Paradigm. So feel free to check that out on my website. And then I know there are a lot of other folks out there who are working on creating religious trauma content right now. It's such a booming niche, which I'm so excited about. A website that I would definitely encourage you to check out is the Reclamation Collective. They have a way to search for therapists who are religious trauma therapists, but they also have a bunch of resources, both for clients and therapists, of support groups, trainings, consultations, things like that. And so, yeah, there's definitely a building archive of resources out there.
And where can people find out more about you and your practice and all of the projects that you have?
Yeah. If you want to learn more about me, visit my website, annaclarkmiller.com, or my consulting business I mentioned that does the trainings, that's empathyparadigm.com. And if you want to read my book, it's on Amazon. You can get it ebook or printed, and it's the Religious Trauma Survival Guide.
And we will include links to all of that in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. And follow us on our social media, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group, to continue on this conversation. And until next time, I'm Curt Whithelm with Katie Vernoy and Anna Clark Miller.
Thanks again to our partner, Therapy Notes, the best practice management solution for behavioral health.
Don't forget to use promo code MODERN for 2 free months. Care more and worry less with Therapy Notes. Don't forget, we've got some fun, interesting, and important CE pod courses over at moderntherapistcommunity.com/pod course.
Head on over and check them out.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.